Open the podcast bay doors, Hal.
Hello everyone, and welcome to episode 138 of Welcome to Geektown. I'm your host, Kurt Onstead. I've been a proud geek all my life, being into role-playing games, board games, sci-fi, fantasy, and especially superheroes and comics. And I want to help others join me in those pursuits, but I've found that sometimes people can get overwhelmed or feel left out because they don't already have what some consider the requisite knowledge to be considered a fan. And that's where Welcome to Geektown comes in. Here you can ask your questions without feeling like a gatekeeper is calling you out for not yet being fully versed in every aspect of your new interest. Before we get started on the topic for this week, I wanted to take a moment to acknowledge a loss recently experienced in the comic book world. For a generation of kids, one man was the voice of Batman, despite multiple other actors taking on the role in live-action projects. That man was Kevin Conroy, who for the last 30 years has portrayed Batman in various animated and video game projects, and even getting to play a live-action Elder Bruce Wayne in the Arrowverse Crisis on Infinite Earths crossover. Although when he was first hired, he barely knew anything about the famous hero, he immediately found the heart of the character and grew to love and protect him, knowing how much the fans cared. He died this week at the too young age of 66 from intestinal cancer. My condolences go out to his husband, the rest of his family, and to all the fellow fans who lost a hero. And although the man may be gone, his voice will remain forever.
I am vengeance. I am the night. I am Batman.
Now, on to lighter subjects. This week we're returning to one of my favorite recurring series, The Replacements. Based on a question by listener and patron Justin Bailey, he asked what happens to the characters that take the place of a hero once the original returns. Since that answer varies so much, we're slowly going through the heroes this has happened to over the years and discussing each one in a little detail. Today, we're going to go over the role taken on by my favorite DC character, The Flash. Before we get started, for reasons that will become apparent, if you aren't already familiar with all of the various reboots in the DC universe, you'll want to go back and listen to episode 1 of this show, or check it out on YouTube, as they are an important part of the various Flash's histories. All caught up? Great. Let's get started. Now, let's begin by acknowledging that the first Flash is not the one that has actually been replaced most of the time. In the golden age of comics, the Flash was Jay Garrick, a scientist who got his speed powers after being exposed to fumes from an experiment involving hard water. Well, the writers said hard water, but I have to believe they meant heavy water, which is water made with oxygen molecules that have an extra neutron, and is used in nuclear reactors to keep the fission process under control. Jay first appeared in Flash Comics number 1 in 1940, but when the first superhero boom died off, he was one of many Golden Age characters who fell into comic book limbo, his series being cancelled in 1949. Several years later, Showcase number 4 introduced us to the Silver Age Flash, Barry Allen. In fact, that comic is considered by most comic book historians to be the very beginning of the Silver Age, as it kicked off the second wave of superhero books that has mostly continued to this day. Originally, Barry was not an in-universe replacement for Jay. The two characters came from different universes, and with 7 years between Jay's final issue and Barry's first, there was only the name connecting them for a while. This is why I don't think of Barry as being a replacement in the same way as other characters we've discussed in previous episodes. Instead, Barry is the one who gets replaced. If your only exposure to the character of the Flash is from movies or live-action TV, then Barry is the one you are familiar with. After being struck by lightning near a rack of chemicals in the police department lab, forensic scientist Barry Allen found himself able to move at superhuman speeds and perform all sorts of tricks with his speed powers. From simple things like creating cyclones by whirling his arms in quick circles, to being able to vibrate his molecules in a way that let him walk through walls and even travel to other dimensions and places in time. Barry stayed the Flash from 1956 all the way up to 1985, when he apparently died in the Crisis on Infinite Earths crossover that led to the reboot of the DC Universe. Taking his place for nearly as many years as Barry held the mantle, our first replacement is Wally West. Wally was originally Flash's sidekick, named Kid Flash. Wally was a big fan of the Flash, and since his Aunt Iris was dating Barry Allen, he got to meet his hero. And in a bizarre coincidence, Wally was also struck by lightning while near an identical rack of chemicals while asking Barry about his origin. After Barry's death, Wally took on the famous red costume and tried to follow in his mentor's footsteps, although he found it very difficult to find his way out of the large shadow that Barry's memory cast. In episode 97, I go into more details on the extraordinarily well-written and drawn tale where he finally comes into his own, called The Return of Barry Allen. I won't spoil that story here, but suffice it to say that Barry didn't actually come back. In later stories, Wally's speed even surpassed that of his mentor, and it has been firmly established that Wally West is truly the fastest man alive. Wally is one of the rare replacements who has actually stuck around for more than a year or two in the role and was genuinely intended to stay in the role for the foreseeable future. Other than a few brief periods that I'll go into in a little bit, Wally West was the title character in the Flash comics for nearly as long as Barry. However, in 2009, Barry Allen truly returned in a miniseries titled The Flash Rebirth. Now, for many fans, their Flash was Wally West, having read only his adventures in the comics, and even seeing him on TV in the DC animated universe, where Wally was a member of the Justice League. But the powers that be wanted Barry back as the one and only Flash. So, in 2011, when the New 52 did a hard reboot on the DC Universe, Wally was nowhere to be seen, apparently retconned away. A new Kid Flash, also named Wally West, was introduced, and although he has grown into a strong character in his own right, this Wally, now called Wallace to differentiate, hasn't reached the heights of popularity his name twin has. If you watch the Flash TV show that is part of the Arrowverse, the Wally that you see there is much closer to the Wallace West of comics than he is to the original Wally. I will admit that I'm a much bigger fan of Wally than I am of Barry, so I was very happy when the character returned from comic book limbo in 2016's DC Rebirth one-shot. Wally's return also heralded many other details from the pre-Flashpoint, post-Zero Hour continuity. At first, Wally's story post-Rebirth was told in the Titans comic, while Barry's tale continued on in The Flash. Wally then went on some cosmic-level adventures, even absorbing the powers of Dr. Manhattan from the Watchmen series, on a quest to save the multiverse. And on a more personal note, his 2 children, who had also been lost to time. Shortly after Wally's return from that adventure, Barry took on a role as a multiversal guardian, joining the Justice League Incarnate, shortly thereafter getting captured by Darkseid and once again getting lost in the multiverse. And so Wally has stepped back into the main Flash role on Earth, with him and his family having their stories told in the Flash comic. In addition to Wally stepping into the mantle here on Earth, yet another Flash is taking Barry's place in the Justice League Incarnate, and that is Avery Ho, the fastest woman alive, aka the Flash of China. Thanks mostly to the work of Grant Morrison, DC has fleshed out an entire Justice League's worth of heroes in the Pacific Asian region, including a Superman, Batman, and most importantly for this subject, a Flash. Avery Ho first appeared in 2016's The Flash No. 3, written by Josh Williamson and drawn by Carmine Di Giandomenico, and was one of many people affected by a Speed Force storm that gave many people super speed. However, Avery was one of the very few whose powers remained after this storyline, and she has since gone on to become a trusted ally of the Flash and other heroes around the world, and now the multiverse. She is currently acting as Barry's replacement as of this recording, so we have yet to know what her fate will be after his eventual return. Return? In addition to the people who have replaced Barry over the years, Wally's tenure was long enough that he had 3 replacements. First up, we have the alternate timeline version of Wally, named Walter West. This Flash's timeline had been basically identical until the woman he loved, Linda Park, was killed in an epic battle with the cult known as Cobra, which nearly happened in the main timeline in issue number 100. When Wally later appeared to die, or at least get absorbed into the Speed Force, in issue number 150, Walter took this opportunity to hop dimensions and take Wally's place. This version of the Flash had even more speed tricks up his sleeve, but was also a much darker take on the character, with his grief leading him to use much more brutal methods to take down his foes. This story lasted about 10 issues, with Walter leaving not long before Wally returned. The last time we saw him, Walter landed on an Earth similar to our own, where the stories of superheroes are told in comic books, and he got to see that things ended on a happy note on the world he just left. The second of Wally's replacements is the Flash of the future known as John Fox. After the events of the Dead Heat storyline, in which Flash defeated Savitar by pushing him into the Speed Force, Wally was stuck in time, bouncing from era to era, often running into other speedsters who were able to help him take another attempt at getting home. One of those run-ins was with John Fox, who was the Flash of the 27th century. Concerned that Wally might not ever get home in his condition and prevent an artificial ice age that John had read about, and also being frustrated at being replaced by superfast robots known as speed metal, shortly after Wally left, John stole some time travel technology and went to the 20th century to step in for Wally. However, in a paradoxical turn of events, it was actually John in the 20th century who was preventing Wally from getting home in the first place. When John took on the mantle of the Flash, he did so with the help of Wally's girlfriend, Linda. John quickly fell for her himself, and the relationship that burgeoned between them broke Wally's connection to his home time, as Linda's love acts as a sort of lightning rod for Wally, drawing him home. When Linda eventually spurned John's advances, Wally soon returned, and the two Flashes together ended up preventing the disaster that John had originally come to prevent. Shortly after Wally returning to the 20th century, the speed metal robots from the 27th century showed up to bring John back home and punish him for his theft and for meddling in the past. John and Wally together defeated one wave of the robots, but realizing this would never end if he stayed in the past, John ended up traveling to the far future, specifically the 853rd century. where he joined Justice Legion Alpha, sometimes called Justice Legion A. We find this out in the DC 1 Million crossover event, where all of DC's titles were moved forward to issue number 1 million, to show what the DC universe will be like in the 853rd century, which is about where the millionth issue of those books would be if the numbering had continued monthly. Since that crossover, we've only seen John and the rest of Justice Legion Alpha a couple of times, but John seems to be happy in the far future, one of the rare true happy endings for the replacements in this episode. One final side note about John. Artist Oscar Jimenez drew the time-traveling Flash to resemble Scott Bakula, including the silver streak in his hair, and made other oblique references to Quantum Leap, which Bakula was best known for starring in, mirroring Wally's bouncing through time trying to get home. The character's name was taken from John Broome, who created both Barry and Wally, and Gardner Fox, the creator of Jay Garrick. John Fox himself was originally created by Mark Waid and Mike Parabeck in the 1990 Flash special, returning for this storyline also written by Waid in 1996. The final replacement is none other than the grandson of the Silver Age Flash, Bart Allen. Now, before Crisis on Infinite Earths, Barry and his wife Iris had traveled to the 30th century, which, in a only in comics kind of story, it turns out Iris was originally from. The two started a family in the future, raising fraternal twins Dawn, spelled D-O-N, and Dawn, D-A-W-N, also known as the Tornado Twins, both of whom had a child of their own. The female Dawn gave birth to future Legionnaire Jenny Ognitz, superhero name XS, while the male Dawn had a son named Bart. Unfortunately, Bart's super speed was aging him artificially, and so he was already in the body of a 13-year-old, even though chronologically he was less than a year. Iris brought Bart back to the 20th century, believing that Wally could help the young speedster. Fortunately, he was able to help stabilize him and stop Bart's accelerated aging. Bart stayed in the 20th century, taking on the name Impulse, and had his own adventures for a while in his own solo book and as part of the team called Young Justice. Fans of the CW Flash show may recognize XS and Impulse as Barry's children rather than his grandkids, skipping entirely over the Tornado Twins in favor of the more recent creations. Bart has been portrayed mostly as a frivolous character. He was raised in virtual reality, the only way to keep up with his accelerated view of the world, and as such, treated life like a video game for much of his early career. He did grow up, however, and first took on the mantle of Kid Flash, which he used for a while as part of the Teen Titans. Then, in Infinite Crisis, the Speed Force seemed to disappear, taking all of the speedsters with it, except for the original Jay Garrick. Bart returned from the Speed Force, having apparently aged 4 years in the process, and being one of the only two remaining speedsters, took on the Flash name and costume for a year, publishing time. Unfortunately, his run as the Flash was cut short, as he was killed by the Rogues, the collective name of Flash's most common recurring villains, in Flash, the Fastest Man Alive, number 13. Bart was later resurrected by his fellow 31st century residents, the Legion of Superheroes, during the final Crisis storyline, one of the rare instances with a Crisis story going well for a speedster. Since then, Bart has returned to the Impulse name and costume. As of this recording, he can be seen in the Dark Crisis Young Justice miniseries, alongside fellow replacements Tim Drake and Connor Kent, Robin and Superman/Superboy respectively. Check episodes 15 and 58 for more info on them. In addition to all of these characters, there have been literally dozens of others who have taken the name of the Flash. However, all of these other heroes are from various points in the future, like John Fox. However, unlike John, they have never actually directly taken on the mantle from one of the main characters in their title, and their appearances have been so short that they don't count as full replacements. Well, that wraps up our episode for this week. I'll be back in 2 weeks, hopefully with a brand new listener question to answer. If you have any questions about comics, board games, sci-fi, fantasy, or any other geeky subject, please send me an email at welcome2geektown, all spelled out, @gmail.com. Or ask your question anonymously if you prefer by clicking Submit a Question at welcome2, the number 2 in this case, geektown.com, where the name and email fields can be left blank if you want. Other contact options include facebook.com/welcome-to-geektown or Twitter @geektownpodcast. Also, if you'd like to support the show directly, come become a patron at patreon.com/welcome-to-geektown for just $1 per month to get access to full scripts of the shows, audio outtakes, and a monthly shoutout. You can also help the show grow by subscribing and giving a 5-star review over on Apple Podcasts to join the Geektown City Council, which helps other people find the show so we can all tell them, welcome to Geektown, population, us. Welcome to Geektown is written, narrated, edited, and produced by me, Kurt Onstead. Theme music is by Aaron Lovitz, logo art by Archie Santana. All other sound clips of the copyrighted material, their respective owners, and no infringement is intended, falling under fair use.